we'll get to the other stuff later, but first we have to make sure that they're okay. We do, as you can see in the middle bar, demobilizations, diffusings, debriefings. These are the actual interventions that we use, and they are peer supported. So peers are trained to use these interventions with their peers. So if we have, for instance, we would do a demobilization. I've been on the scene of a house fire where children have been killed. And so we'll go, and before the firefighters can leave the scene, before the police will leave the scene, we try to do a transition for them from that terrible scene to going back to the station, going back to the job, going back to their regular life. And prepare them with a lot of education about what stress does and what they can expect. And we tell them over and over again that they're reacting normally to an abnormal event. Again, it's not a deficit model. It's helping them understand that what's happening is absolutely normal. Sometimes we do diffusings, really difficult situations that I'm thinking of a murder or a suicide that can be very difficult for firefighters and police, and we will go back and do a diffusing where you sit down with the group that experienced it and walk them through certain steps so that we can, again, it's helped them transition into a better place. And a lot of it, again, is education. And we do debriefings, which are a much more formal process. That's where the clinician has to be on as part of it. But we do have it mostly peer-led because we need the people that we're supporting to know that we understand what they're going through, that we've been there, that we get it, that we understand what their culture is like. And then we do follow-up, and that's really important. We do counseling, but we don't do psychotherapy. And when it comes to that point, we refer people out, work with EAP plans. I'm sure you're all familiar with your employee assistance plans. So what we're doing is we're trying to reduce the amount of PTSD that we see in the fire service and in anyone who's been through traumatic events. Like I said, it does get tricky. We do know that what might be a traumatic event for one might not be for another. So we respond as called. A chief or a chief officer has to call us in because we can't know. I went to a Western Rhode Island fire station about a month ago. There was a car accident. It seemed like a normal car accident, which I'm sorry, but if you're in the fire service, car accidents are very normal, and including deaths. So I was perplexed as to why, what it was different about this one. Well, there was a brand new firefighter. There was a delay in getting help. There was some chaos on the scene. Somebody died that was the same age as someone else at home. It was this calamity. It was all this waterfall of different events that made it extraordinarily difficult for these firefighters to have gone through, and these rescue workers. And we ended up doing a debriefing, which evidence shows us that certainly anecdotally, the fire personnel find it extraordinarily helpful, and research shows us that it does reduce the amount of PTSD that we see in first responders. That's why I think you see places like the Rhode Island State Police, Kent Hospital, and colleges across the country starting to create their own teams so that we can support those who have to support others. So we'll pass it along to the person's going to talk about the psychological.
We're pleased to have with us today Connecticut State Representative Marilyn Guglielmo. She's a member of the Education Committee in the state legislature. She's a school psychologist in the Old Lyme School District, and she's a former chair of the Middlesex Mental Health Council. So she's going to talk to us about the psychological impact of critical incidents at school on teachers, students, and parents.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all for being here today. Just to give you a little overview of what my talk will encompass, I'm going to draw heavily from the Dawson College shooting study. It was probably one of the largest studies that was done on an active shooter in a school setting. It had almost 1,000 respondents, and it was done over a 3-year period. Some very significant findings, and a part of this whole issue of psychological impact of critical incidents that we oftentimes don't look at. I'm going to walk you through what is different, because trauma is variable. If you think in terms of a continuum, mild, moderate to severe, there are traumas, as Holly was saying, a car accident, well, certainly a traumatic event, a life-threatening storm, traumatic event, an assault, a robbery, and then there's an active school shooter. So all trauma is not equal. I'd like to walk you through the most predictable outcomes immediately post-event, which would be PTSD, which we had just talked about, and also acute stress disorders. I want to give you the manifestations psychologically of the differences between PTSD in adults and in children. I'd also like to kind of share with you how this has affected the psychological community. And you would think that of all the communities to be concerned about, why them? But the business of school shootings, and I think particularly the Sandy Hook shooting, has caused all of us to reconceptualize how do we recognize, what should we be expecting when an event like this occurs in our schools, how should we be moving in on those things, how do we look at trauma, how do we look at exposure in these types of critical incidents, how do we look at grief. Let's get back to the Dawson College shooting. The Dawson College shooting study was the largest of its kind to be undertaken. I said there were about 1,000 respondents. There were actually 948 of them, and 79% of them were actually present at Dawson College during the shooting. Now, Dawson College is up in Quebec province, and what happened there is that there had been 3 incidents in the province of Quebec between 1989 and 2006. And finally in 2006, the government commissioned the research arm of McGill University to do this in-depth study because, so they got their funding, they got their grant, and they had at it for a 3-year period. It was a massive undertaking, but I think the data continues to stand and to hold us in good stead in terms of the clinical information that it gives to us. So 79% of the respondents, and those respondents, nearly 1,000, big study, were at the college at the time of the shooting. More than 1/3 of the respondents witnessed someone being wounded or killed. 50% of people heard gunshots. And after the shooting, a full 18% of people, of these respondents, developed some form of mental illness, a mental health event. Now, I want to talk about event exposure because how close you are to the actual vortex of the trauma, seeing the shooter, hearing gunshots, aiding the wounded, seeing people who have been murdered or wounded, is very predictive of how impactful and how at risk you are as an individual. While we expect under these circumstances that there's going to be an increase in post-traumatic stress disorder, what was not ever anticipated and what was found in the Dawson study was that major depression, substance abuse, social phobia also became very prominent. And in fact, a greater than normal incidence of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts in those who had that up-close event exposure. Also, what Dawson discovered, and bears us remembering, is that those who had experienced some kind of mental health dysfunction post-event were likely to have that dysfunction continue for a period of 18 months or more. Those most at risk for enduring dysfunction, psychological dysfunction, were those who were closest to the event. Again, we're talking about exposure. So, those who were closer to the event, the greater the risk of developing a mental disorder. There's another group. So we have to conceptualize teachers, students, and I was also asked to talk about parents. And I want to just reflect back for a moment on what happened at Sandy Hook, because obviously I was at my office at school the morning that occurred. Very unusual. Principal came over the intercom and said, all staff read your emails immediately. Never had I heard that command before. Obviously, we knew immediately what was happening. So as a team of psychologists, our job was to assemble helpful information and resources immediately to deal with our parents. But throughout that day, as the tragedy of Sandy Hook unwound, I want to include parents in a different category of event exposure. These poor parents of the kids, some who lived and some who did not, were sequestered off in an area while the school was locked down and cordoned off by police and emergency management personnel. Imagine for a moment the horror of not knowing what has happened to your loved one. And I will state to you that we should just as readily hold this as a kind of significant and traumatic psychological impact, just as the hearing of gunshots, the seeing wounded, all the rest of the events that occur in the context of an active shooter in a school. So we know that post-traumatic stress, also acute stress disorder. No surprises, acute stress disorder is something that's going to happen to people very predictably who have witnessed these sorts of traumatic events, and we expect that in the first month. The clinical and diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder is that when you get past that 1 month interval, you still are suffering. And what you find in the literature is that rates of acute stress disorder in general range from 6% to 33%. So the rates change for different types of trauma. But as I had said earlier, car accidents, assaults, life-threatening storms, shootouts in schools. When it came to Dawson College, the school shooting study, the range from 6 to 33%, you can guess that those respondents were at the 33% range in terms of the experience of acute stress disorder immediately post-event. They also were twice as likely to develop post-traumatic stress syndrome and to experience it for a longer period of time. What does PTSD look like in kids? I mean, I've spent my entire professional life working with children. So I think many of us know in perhaps a factual way or a colloquial way what PTSD looks like in parents. We understand about, and I think we talk a lot about the experiences of veterans in active combat. But in children, it looks a little different. Depression in adults is so different from depression in children. Adults, they'll be lethargic, lose interest in, formerly activities of preference. They may have some difficulty sleeping. Affect gets kind of flat. And then there are children. Now, children manifest depression in a very different way. The same clinical category, very different presentation. Kids are going to become irritable, defiant, non-compliant. They'll act up, they'll act out. Same disorder, different presentation. So I want to walk you through just a little bit as educators what PTSD looks like in children. A lot of times they will show intense fear, helplessness, sadness, or just not want to talk about an event at all. Sometimes they are so deadened to what you know was a terrible wounding to them personally that it's considered to be dissociation, a psychological term for a kind of psychological numbing. They become depressed and withdrawn from their feelings. Sometimes they have to act out and talk about the trauma time and time and time again. And oftentimes you'll see somatic complaints pop up. There'll be the frequent flyers to the nursing station. And pre-trauma, that wasn't who they were. suffer from PTSD worry about dying at an early age. And it causes me to pause and wonder what those 6- and 7-year-olds at Sandy Hook, what their futures are like. I was sharing with Dave earlier before we began the program that as adults, we have age and experience on our side. We have built up frustration tolerance, we have built resilience. We've had hardship, hopefully we've overcome it in an adaptive way. What about a 6-year-old who cannot draw from age, experience, personal fortitude? We like to kind of glibly say that kids are resilient, and perhaps they are. But let me once again remind you of that trauma continuum, mild, moderate, severe. We are at the game-changing end of the trauma continuum when we talk about school shooters. Another thing about kids, they can be very irritable, they can be angry, they can be ashamed and upset that they lived and friends did not. They may have trouble sleeping, they may be easily startled and frightened. All of these things. And I'm talking not just a month out post-event, but going out potentially for years for kids who have had this extreme exposure. One point I want to make about grief. This whole event of active school shooters has caused the psychological community to begin to reconceptualize grief. Again, as adults, when we lose a loved one, we understand upset, mourning, denial, the helplessness, the sorrow. When you have unexpected, sudden, traumatic death, murder of children, that kind of grief transcends what we know about grief. So much so that the American Psychological Association, many of you probably know, just the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's our clinician's handbook, the DSM. The DSM-5 just came out, but currently the APA has a working group studying what they are terming complicated grief. And complicated grief does not follow the normal parameters that we have always known within the mourning and grieving process. There's just an extreme, the kind of attributes that the APA has enumerated to date is this: extreme focus on the loss and reminders of the loved one, intense longing or pining for the deceased, problems accepting the death, numbness, preoccupation with sorrow, an inability to enjoy life, trouble carrying out normal routines, agitation, and a lack of trust. So right now, and this is sort of a little glimpse into the workings of how psychologists and clinicians are trying to deal with this, but clearly as a country and as a state, we have experienced events that are unprecedented, so much so that we're starting to reorganize how we, in a psychological sense, conceptualize grief. So all of these, I simply ask, in your heads and in your hearts, as educators, as researchers, as people who are just concerned about the experience of teachers, kids, and their parents within the school day, ponder some of this when you have a moment, because the events of the recent past have been game changers that we need to sensitize ourselves about.
Thank you for a powerful presentation. Our final speaker before David Alba discusses what he's been listening to today is Connecticut State Senator Kevin Whitgos. Kevin is the Deputy Minority Leader Pro Tem and Caucus Chair of the Outreach, or for Outreach. He's a member of the Senate Public Safety and Security Committee. Perhaps quite importantly, he's a retired sergeant with the Canton Police Department. He's a former vice chairman of the Canton Board of Education. This is some nice credentials to talk to us today. And his topic is going to be statewide legislative policy on school safety, proactive or reactive.
addition to my serving as a police sergeant for 28 years, I also have the good fortune of serving in my local volunteer fire service for 10. And I was elected to the State House of Representatives. I retired from the fire service as a fire chief, and I also had the opportunity to spend 5 years serving in a volunteer ambulance. So public safety has really been in my blood. I certainly can speak towards when tragedies such as what we're experiencing across our country happen. It brings back a lot of memories for me. And you certainly don't forget. And we have some time again. I'll share with you the experience I had. I shared it on the Senate floor one day. But we never thought it would happen here in Connecticut. In fact, after the 1991 Columbine shooting, when local law enforcement began training in schools, we still didn't think it would happen here. But we were preparing in case it did. We fine-tuned our training at the time when we would respond to, this is drills or training, to a shooting at a school. We would get to the school, we'd form a perimeter, we would wait for the SWAT team to arrive, or the special services team, we'd call in negotiators, and we'd begin that formal process to hopefully leave everything in a calm scenario that everybody walks away safely. Unfortunately, through the times, we found that that doesn't work, and that's not what's happening. So we trained to an active shooter scenario where a call is placed, and generally 911, the police respond. As long as there's 2 officers there, you enter the school, you go directly to the sound of gunfire, and you eliminate the threat. Although we did train for that, we didn't expect it to happen here. What could we have done to prevent such a tragedy? Well, as you know, Sandy Hook happened December 14th, 2012. Soon thereafter, the legislative leaders formed a bipartisan task force to examine how we could prevent such a tragedy from happening again in the state of Connecticut. The task force was further broken down into 3 different subgroups. One would deal with gun violence, one would deal with school safety, and one would deal with mental health. I served on the gun violence task force and the school safety working group. And we were charged with finding consensus recommendations to improve the school safety. And to fulfill that obligation, we had 2 informational hearings, 1 public hearing, where we participated in the Newtown public hearing. In our first meeting, we reviewed our state statutes to see what we had in place, and we found there was no specific state statute that requires school boards to establish an emergency safety plan or safety management plan. You know, the very basic of just having a plan, there was nothing in our statutes. So the answer to the theme of my topic, what we're supposed to talk about, is are we proactive or are we reactive? And the short answer is it's kind of both. And the proactive initiatives seem to drip from the legislative faucet, but when we react to circumstances that are impactful, like the Newtown shooting, things come flooding out of the legislative faucet. And with the passage of Senate Bill 1160, which was the big combined bill of the task force, I think Connecticut has opened that faucet, which will require a more fluid approach to school safety throughout our state. And the premise of our task force, can we prevent a school shooting from ever happening again? And the answer is no. And we learned from experts that we had in that what happened in Newtown is called a black swan event. And a black swan event is basically when somebody comes in from the outside to a school, a business, or another public place. You won't anticipate it. They're generally low in frequency, but they're high in impact, and they're virtually impossible to predict. But according to the FBI, we predict very accurately all, or almost all, internal school shootings, because 95% of the school shooters attend the schools that they're attacked. And there's a couple of myths that are out there that pertain to school shooters, 4 myths specifically. Number 1, people think that, oh, the shooter, they just snapped something happened in their brain and they just went on a rampage. Well, that's not true, because the shootings that took place really required a very sophisticated level of planning. 2, they were on some kind of drugs. They're high in drugs. That's why they would do something like that. That's not true either. The autopsies of most of the children that were found deceased, or they took their own life, or their lives were taken, found that most of them, if not all of them, were not on drugs, illegal drugs. Most of them were on antidepressants. And the 3rd is that mass murders are increasing. A mass murder, according to the FBI statistics, is 4 or more persons dying in one event. And again, that's not true, it's not increasing. The average 2 to 25 per year across our country, and that's just being unfortunately maintained. Our legislation that we passed and it was signed into law by Governor Malloy requires that the Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection and the State Department of Education develop a statewide school security and safety plan standards. The standards have to be developed by January 1, 2014. And then we've required the local boards of education to establish their own school safety and security committee at each of the schools to assist in the development of safety and security of the plans in their school. Those plans have to be implemented by July 1, 2014 and reviewed annually. So the state will have theirs in place, the standards by January 1. Each local school district has 6 months to have their plan in place. And as part of that plan, the state has mandated at a minimum a local police officer, a local first responder, a teacher, a mental health professional, and an administrator employed at the school must serve on that committee. But unlike curriculum, which seems as though we as a legislature, never have a problem changing, whether that's graduation requirements or in-school suspension or required classes to be taught. We recognize when we're going through our deliberations that we're talking about school buildings, and that's bricks and mortar, and that cannot be easily changed without a considerable amount of cost. So keeping the cost in mind, we heard loud and clear from the experts that you want to fortify your schools, but you don't want to create fortresses, because children still have to be educated in a pro-learning environment. So what we've done is we've established a school safety infrastructure council consisting of experts in school and building security trades, and they will develop standards by January 1, 2014 as well. Some of the standards that they're looking at are, you wouldn't notice them if you were just to walk into school. It's replacing hollow core doors with solid core doors, 2 inches thick. Replacing the glass in the door of a classroom with ballistic glass. Double door access, computer-controlled electronic locks. A lot of schools have the buzzer now, you can push it on the outside. Cameras throughout the use of the schools, especially at entrances and exits. Penetration-resistant vestibules, and any other security and infrastructure improvements that industry comes along with. And those will be available, must be available by January 1, 2014. And any town that is looking to build a school now must incorporate those standards in your new school building project, and those will be reimbursable through the regular school construction process. And while we were talking about that, we seemed to focus as a committee on the K-12 education, but we said, well, why are we only focusing on K-12? So we added a safety component for our colleges and our universities as well, and I agree with that philosophy. Each of those institutions of higher education must biannually review their security protocol plans and submit them to the DESPP, which is our state police organization. And not later than January 1, 2014, each institution must also establish a training